More disturbing reports of violence emerge from Myanmar, where hundreds of thousands of people have been protesting against the military junta, which overthrew the nationally elected government and jailed the country's beacon of democracy, Aung San Suu Kyi. The United Nations says at least 54 people have been killed by security forces since the coup happened, and more than 1,700 people have been arbitrarily arrested as soldiers and police reportedly conduct door-to-door searches and brutally attack and detain politicians, activists and journalists. The UN's top human rights official last week urged the Myanmar military to stop murdering and jailing protesters. But the warning of firm action appears to have fallen on deaf ears. Myanmar's military said that it is ready to withstand sanctions and isolation. We discussed the developments today and what kind of urgent action is needed to help and protect the people of Myanmar. And for this, we connect with Dr. Azim Ibrahim, who is an author on human rights in Myanmar and the director of New Lines Institute, joining us from Washington, D.C. Very warm welcome to you, Dr. Ibrahim. How are you today?
Very well. Thank you so much for having me, So Young.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. And, well, we've heard about this escalation of violence in Myanmar over the past week, and the deaths of 54 people over the past month killed by security forces. That was just devastating and, of course, all the more horrifying for the people of Myanmar. How far do you think the military is going to go? And do you think that the situation could possibly escalate even further?
Well, So Young, the military have painted themselves into a corner here in terms of how far they will go. It seems that they want to go as far as possible to ensure that they maintain control over Myanmar. I don't think they anticipated the protests would last this long and it'll be of this severity. And as you said, dozens upon dozens of people have died. In one day alone, 38 people died. Is an astonishing amount. And the military is using quite aggressive, violent tactics, arresting protesters in the middle of the night with night raids, etc. So I think they've painted themselves into a corner, and how they get out of this is going to be very complicated. We've already seen one or two senior kind of military defections, so I anticipate that some of those will continue. I think we might see more defections. I think a lot of people in the military are probably unhappy with the way things are turning out, because we also have to understand that this coup was instigated by one individual. That's the Army Chief General Min Aung Hlaing, and he had his own motivation to protect himself from any possible ICJ investigation, to protect his wealth when he was expected to step down later this year in retirement. So he's protecting himself, which is one of the reasons why he instigated the coup, and now it's turning out to be very bad for the entirety of Myanmar and its future.
And the military, it seems to be, well, it's continuing to pass very repressive laws. And there was news over the weekend that the military hired an Israeli lobbyist to try and reach out to the Western governments and telling them that, and the lobbyist saying that the Myanmar military didn't like the way Aung San Suu Kyi was getting so close to the Chinese. What do you make of all these? What do you make of these developments? And do you think that the Myanmar military is hoping that if they wait this out, this will go away and they'll be perhaps recognised as a legitimate government?
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. They've hired this lobbyist who specialises in these kinds of things, of whitewashing images of regimes around the globe. And it was interesting that they put an accusation on Aung San Suu Kyi that she was far too close to the Chinese, and the military were very unhappy with this. And obviously, they're trying to appeal to a Western audience. It's also interesting that they're trying to blame the Rohingya genocide upon Aung San Suu Kyi as well, saying that the military wasn't happy with this, even though the military were the key architects behind the Rohingya genocide. And Aung San Suu Kyi was essentially, even though she later became a cheerleader, she was not actually involved in the decision making of the army. So this is a process of trying to whitewash. I think what the military is trying to do is trying to wait this out as best as they can. They're suspicious of the Chinese interfering in Myanmar, but China, on the other hand, is trying to balance both the West, the United Nations, and the Myanmar situation very carefully. They have considerable investment in Myanmar through the CMAC, the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor, over 100 billions over $100 billion worth of investment in an economy that's only about 71 billion. So China is by far the biggest investor. And one of the things that they don't want to do is to alienate the military regime, particularly if it becomes a permanent fixture, if it normalizes itself and actually becomes the legitimate government of Myanmar, legitimate in the sense that they actually have full control over the country. China simply cannot risk its investment being compromised in any way, which is why they're trying to be very careful in terms of balancing, calls for stability, but at the same time, they refer to the coup originally, not as a coup, but as a cabinet reshuffle. So they're trying to keep the military on side as well to protect their investments.
Right, so countries like Russia and China and some Southeast Asian nations, they're calling for stability, but stability for whom? Well, meanwhile, anti-coup protesters, they're calling for international intervention based on the responsibility to protect. And in the past, the Obama government, it was criticised for avoiding military intervention in Syria, where authorities were using chemical weapons on civilians. Do you see a similar situation here? Do you see a similar kind of hesitancy to take strong action this time around?
I think this is a very different situation. I think the situation in Syria, you had a brutal dictator, Bashar al-Assad, who was genuinely in the process of trying to kill innocent civilians. He was not necessarily trying to regain control. He was simply trying to terrorize the civilian population using chemical weapons and barrel bombs. So the objective there was to kill as many people as possible, to terrify them, to subdue the civilian population into submission. Here, I think the military is trying to get control of the situation. And I think if the civilians simply went back home, the military would actually be delighted, and that wasn't necessarily the case in Syria. But more importantly, the options of the United States in terms of intervention are very limited. What kind of intervention are you looking at here? Militarily, it's inconceivable to see any sort of military intervention. I think what you can really hope for is to have a very robust sanctions regime targeted against military leadership. Many of them are extremely wealthy, have enriched themselves dramatically. They have significant offshore holdings in Macau and China and Singapore. And for the United States to try to target some of that, I think it will be much more effective. We also seen that straight after the military takeover, the military tried to withdraw over $1 billion that was held in the United States, which the US immediately blocked. So they have significant financial holdings which have to be targeted, but also targeted the actual individual generals who are the architects of this military takeover.
And of course, the United Kingdom called for another Security Council meeting at the United Nations. They held a meeting on Friday, which ended yet again without a joint statement on what action to take on Myanmar. Now, why is a consensus at the UNSC so crucial, and what does this lack of compromise really, what does this lack of consensus really compromise in terms of taking effective action? Is there some way of getting Russia and China on board with this?
Yeah, so I don't anticipate the Security Council to pass any sort of resolution to condemn Myanmar, particularly with the language that's been proposed by the United Kingdom. China will simply not allow that. They simply don't agree with any sort of censure when it's interfering in a country's internal affairs, because I think they simply know that after Myanmar, next will be China on the list of being under international sanction of some sort. But it's also interesting to see that there was a vote in the Human Rights Council, and China abstained from that vote. They didn't veto it; they simply abstained. So I think that's indicative that China is willing to move, but I don't anticipate it'll be from the Security Council. I think China is essentially trying to play both sides, trying to make sure that it keeps the regime on side to protect its long-term financial investment, and at the same time, trying to make sure that there's some sort of push and pressure to return to stability, which seems to be eluding everybody at the moment.
And Indonesia has been supporting the idea of having fresh elections, although the one in November was perfectly legitimate. And while Indonesia and its fellow members of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, they're seeking dialogue with Myanmar's military generals. They see this as an effective way of getting concessions rather than the sanctions as endorsed by Western nations. But is it fair to call for restraint from all sides as ASEAN did? And wouldn't seeking concessions from the junta legitimize its illegal imposition of power? What is your assessment of ASEAN's approach to this crisis?
Yeah, I think ASEAN, who have a very strict policy of non-interference in the internal affairs of member countries, I think they're actually playing this relatively quite well. I think Indonesia's position of not calling for a return of respecting the November elections in Myanmar or calling for the release of Aung San Suu Kyi is actually quite a clever strategy. All they're actually saying is for the military to hold fresh elections, which is something that the military themselves actually proposed. They said that their reasoning behind detaining Aung San Suu Kyi was that the elections in November were corrupt and they were rigged, and they themselves will hold elections, fresh elections, in later this year in 2021. So all Indonesia is saying that, look, we will hold you to account, we will hold you to that. To hold those elections. So it allows the military, it gives them a ladder to climb down, it allows them to save face, whilst at the same time, calling, actually having fresh elections. So Indonesia, I think, is trying to help to stabilize the situation and allow the Myanmar military a way out of this situation, which I think they've completely underestimated in terms of the anger against the militia regime. And it's also, I think, very indicative of ASEAN taking this position, because they usually don't have internal interference. So this is a way of them actually trying to get around that.
I see. Well, meanwhile, of course, we're dealing with a huge human rights situation here, Dr. Ibrahim, and there's worrying news that 168 Rohingya nationals in the Indian city of Jammu have been jailed, and they're facing deportation back to Myanmar, and that would be back under the regime that aimed to annihilate them 4 years ago. What needs to be done to protect them?
Yeah, well, it's not just India. I think other countries are very keen on trying to repatriate the Rohingya. Bangladesh, for example, was in discussions with the civilian government for quite some time on repatriating over 1 million of the Rohingya that are in Bangladesh. And obviously that has now come to a standstill. So Bangladesh is in a very unfortunate situation. They are now hosting over 1 million Rohingya in the largest refugee camp in the world. It's costing Bangladesh over $900 million a year. This is one of the most densely populated countries in the world, with the land mass is shrinking every year because of climate change. And now they've come to the realization that the Rohingya will likely become a permanent fixture in Bangladesh. So they are themselves keen of trying to repatriate the Rohingya, but this is going to be untenable, even if some sort of agreement could be reached, and the military decides that this is a good way for them to kind of re-establish their image around the globe as more of a humanitarian entity, and put all the blame on Aung San Suu Kyi. This is going to be very untenable, because you are repatriating refugees onto a regime that were not only the architects of the genocide, but are now in full control of the country. And the reality is so young, is that the Rohingya have nowhere to go back to, whether it's 168 or whether it's 1 million. The lands that they occupied in Rakhine State, the villages were burnt down, they were bulldozed, and the land has already been redistributed to local Rakhine. So they actually have nowhere to physically go back to. So that further complicates the situation, even if you could possibly repatriate them.
Well, there really seems to be no easy way out of this situation. And the Myanmar generals themselves, they're saying that they're prepared to go with isolation and sanctions. How then, what do you think should be the next step in order to really move forward from this and try to restore democracy back to the people of Myanmar, and also address this grave human rights violation and situation that is going on for the Rohingya minority?
Yeah, there is no easy solution to this. As you said, the deputy military chief, So Win, has actually said that Myanmar simply has to learn to walk with very little friends and walk alone, and they simply have to learn to weather these sanctions. So they themselves are clearly preparing for the long haul. In terms of the actual solution, trying to move forward, it's actually very difficult to say. I think the ASEAN initiative is certainly most welcome, to allow Myanmar, to allow the military to kind of save face and step down, hold fresh elections. But that will simply not happen until the military is completely confident that the NLD has been removed as a electoral force, and that means keeping Aung San Suu Kyi permanently in prison. Also means removing a lot of the leadership of the NLD, and that's over 40 of them are in prison at the moment, so sentencing them to a long-term prison sentences and then having fresh elections. I think that's the only way that the military will probably get out of this. I think another possibility, which has not been really discussed significantly, is that there's also a possibility of a counter coup. I think there's lots of people within the military that are very unhappy with the way things are going. This is not what they signed up for. This was instigated by one individual. The military in Myanmar is usually very hierarchical in terms of its command and control, but there are senior generals, I anticipate, who are not very happy with this. And the idea of a counter coup should not be ruled out, and I think that's something that we should keep an eye out for.
Hopefully, civil servants, policemen, members of the military, as you said, they will continue to see more and more defections from the military junta and really take a stand against them. And well, we're out of time, I'm afraid, so this is where we'll have to leave the discussion today. But Dr. Azim Ibrahim, author on human rights in Myanmar and director of New Lines Institute, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks so much for having me, So-Won.
And to our viewers around the world, as always, thank you very much for watching.